Welcome to the Holistic Success Show, where we uncover expert insights on today's most pressing topics in higher education, from evidence-based admissions processes to designing student-centered programs and policies. I'm your host, Dr. Kelly Dore, and in this season, we're exploring Success Reimagined, a theme devoted to understanding what it truly means to thrive in a world full of change. Today, we're taking a wide-angled view of higher education itself, as colleges and universities face demographic shifts, financial pressures, technological transformations, policy changes, and politics. A key question arises. How can institutions evolve without abandoning the values that define them? I'm honored to be joined by Ian Wilhelm, a veteran journalist and deputy managing editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education. Ian has spent over 20 years covering the intersections of education, policy, philanthropy, and innovation. His reporting has helped shape the national conversation around the future of higher education. Ian, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to flip the script here and have you in the hot seat.
Yes, Kelly, I usually prefer to be the person asking questions, so I'll do my best in answering them as well, but I'm excited to be here too.
That's great. Well, let's jump in. I would like to start with the big picture. Ian, you're in a really unique position. You've spent your career tracking trends and challenges shaping higher education itself. What do you see as the biggest forces driving institutional change today?
I think you mentioned some of them right at the top. I think the demographic cliff and the enrollment challenges, we're finally here, and we've been talking about it for a long time, but that is certainly shaping a lot of how higher education is thinking now. Obviously, that has implications financially. The other one certainly being, you mentioned as well, the AI and technology that continues to transform institutions. And sort of the wild card a little bit is the Trump administration. We've seen a lot of policy changes. So those are certainly the big three: Trump administration, enrollment challenges, as well as sort of technology shifts. But Kelly, I was going to briefly mention a couple of other ones that I think that we dug into as part of what we do every year. We do a trends report at the Chronicle, where we try and point out a couple that are certainly, I don't think our audience is going to be like, oh, I've never thought of that, but we think are a little bit undercovered. And I think they're worth raising here. I'm not going to go through them all, but we had one that was called the Campus Cold War, Faculty versus Administrators. Kelly, you're a professor, you know it all the time. That feels like that there's a conflict there potentially, or just some challenges when it comes to shared governance. But we've heard some folks who are longtime observers say this has been a real challenge. And I think that gets to the issues we were talking about, how you overcome those big challenges that are facing higher ed and how you kind of innovate moving forward. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Another one certainly is Title IX or Title VI now, the new Title IX, meaning how the Trump administration is using it to enforce civil rights laws. But I think this one in particular is an interesting one to keep an eye on over time, how Title VI changes and how it enforces or enforcement changes beyond, say, just this administration. The last one I'll mention that we had in this trends report, I'll read just the headline here. Virtual courses used to be the exception. Now they're an expectation. And I think that gets a little bit undercovered. We all talked about during the pandemic, like how everyone learned how to find the Zoom button or they have a remote emergency class. You just see again and again some reporting about how institutions, but really students are expecting this opportunity, even when they have an on-campus experience, even when they're living in a dorm, they still want to occasionally have an option for a hybrid class or a fully online class. That's a pretty significant shift. I think that does get a little bit undercovered when it comes to these conversations about how colleges are changing the trends that they're expecting to meet. So there's a couple areas there that we dug deeper into in our trends report, hopefully kind of provide some light, but I think all of them sort of fall under those big buckets, Trump administration, enrollment challenges, and the impact of technology. I think all three of those are the ones I would highlight, definitely.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up, some of what you described as the undercovered ones, because what really is impacting these institutions, students, faculty, the administration as well, is the complexity of all of these together. It's not just one thing they're tackling at a time. They're trying to figure out how they manage all of these things. So love that you brought up those other pieces as well. In this season of the show, we're talking about Success Reimagined. So in your view, I would love to know how colleges are redefining what success looks like, not just for the students, of course, but also for themselves as mission-driven institutions. That's kind of changing in the current era.
I found this question the most compelling and the hardest to answer. I'm glad you're devoting a whole season to it because it's thoughtful in the way you phrase it in terms of redefining success. I thought about this within the context of what I just raised when it came to this campus Cold War between faculty and administrators. And again, I don't want to overstate it. Many institutions are working fine. The faculty and the administrators work well together. But to me, success right now would be defined as can faculty and administrators find a way to change what they do to better serve students while holding on to the values and traditions of learning that are worth preserving. Getting back to, I think, to your point about the phrase of being mission driven. As I thought about this, I was thinking about a conversation a colleague of mine, David Jesse, had recently with the CFO of Washington State University, this Lisa Brunelli. And she said something that I've heard many times before, but I think it finally hit me in the way she was talking about it and the urgency of it, that colleges and universities can't be everything to everyone, that they were in sort of a growth mode for many years, adding new programs, adding new things, doing a lot of different types of programs, different types of research. But now I think it's a little bit time of trying to rethink back to that, what is that mission really at this core? As she kind of put it, Leslie Brunelli again, setting an institutional vision within the financial constraints is really the key thing that presidents have to do and senior administrators. And I think you have to do that in a way when you're working with faculty specifically and others and staff as well as the campus community broadly, or the community around you and the public as well. Do that without feeling like it's just shrinking. Doing that in a way that's still adhering to your mission, but you're moving forward while you're doing this and maybe saying we're not going to do some of these other things. That's not easy to do. It's easier for me to say, and it's a lot harder to do. But maybe it means fewer sports teams. Maybe it means doubling down on programs for workforce development, or maybe it means doubling down on the liberal arts. Maybe it means, this is a tough one, a merger or a partnership where the unique benefits of your college, the campus, the community, and other constituents, make sure that can endure. So I think some of this is going back, looking historically, what do you do well, maybe what you don't need to do as much within the marketplace broadly. That's, to me, is success right now, is thinking that through, but thinking through in a way where you're doing as a whole campus community. Anytime we see leaders start to get ahead of their community on this issue of trying to change programs, academic programs or others, it doesn't go well, right? And that makes sense. So kind of moving forward, again, as Leslie said, setting an institutional vision while meeting the financial constraints, that's going to be success, I think, for a lot of institutions.
Yeah, and as you say, easier to say, much harder to do.
Yes, and I understand that, as a journalist, new media corporations and companies are thinking about this a lot as well, as we think about what is our real audience, what do we do well, and so I do have some empathy for the idea that that's easiest to say, a hard lesson to swallow sometimes.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that triggers for me when you say that is when I see institutions that are very mission aligned, that so they have a specific purpose, be that like a professional school or be that like an entire institution as a whole. When you get the faculty and the students and the institution itself all collectively moving together on that mission, it does create something a little bit different. Like, I think it does help with your retention of students. It certainly helps with the motivation of faculty and staff as well, which we know is right now not in a great place. And
Right.
There's burnout rates, there's all those other things that we're talking about. But I really like the way that you've described that sort of collective. So, despite the fact that you maybe not doing it for the reasons that you want to do it, with financial pressures and things, there can be a positive piece to that.
Right, exactly.
So, and as we talk about those financial pressures, there are a lot of other external pressures that are facing folks. You spoke about some of the funding constraints that are happening, whether that's politically or for other reasons that are driving that, as well as shifting public trust. There's always been it there as a bit of an undercurrent, but it's really getting talked about a lot more. How do you think institutions can really thoughtfully respond to this without compromising their identity and values?
We were talking about the big trends earlier. This is one I think is a really big one. It's been going along for a while. That is the decline by Americans in the trust of their higher education institutions. And it's very nuanced, right? Obviously, it depends on who you're talking to. It depends on what political leanings they have as well. And it's a very nuanced thing, because I do think of it somewhat as sort of a classic thing we hear. I'm outside Washington, D.C. We always talk about Americans are more, they love their congressman, but they hate Congress. That is, they may say they hate higher education as this thing, or they've lost. They should be careful about hate. They may say they dislike or aspects of higher education as they think of it. But when they talk about their local institution, they may change their value, or you can nuance that question a little bit more. And I also want to caveat this by saying to folks, I've talked to some other folks, say at New America, who point out, this trend of loss in trust is actually for all types of public institutions, religious ones, the government, you can go on and on. So relatively, this may be cold comfort, but relatively, colleges and universities actually do a little bit better than some of those other institutions. Again, I don't think that's going to help anybody or change anyone's ways. So back to your point of like, what can you do about it? We did a public perception report with Langer Research. This was last year, trying to do our own research. And I do want to give some folks, again, I was talking about cold comfort, but this is maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit warmer. 79% of the degree holders we surveyed said their associate's or bachelor's degree was still worth it. So again, when you ask sort of these broad questions about do you trust higher ed, well, there's one thing there, but when you ask, hey, do you think your degree was worth it? Many people, the vast majority in this case, still feel like it was a valuable thing. So that points to higher education still has a very good, alumni base to rely on and to say what it can do. So I think there's slightly two different things here. I certainly think the national associations are going to have been and trying to do more, in part because of their defending higher education. But you do see them trying to have more of a national conversation about this. I think for the individual college, it's more about the local community. It's more about connecting, making sure their value is coming through and showing value there. The college president I talk to pretty regularly is a guy named Keith Curry. He's the president of Compton College out in California. We're doing a virtual event series sponsored by the Ascendium Education Group. And Keith just reminded all of his staff and his administrators, like every interaction you have with people in the public is a chance to have just tick a little bit their view of what a college can be and what a college is. And just sort of describing it that way, that seems like a place where you can focus as opposed to saying, how do we shift like the national narrative? That's such a hard thing to do. But locally, making sure you're aware that every interaction with a parent, with a local business or a partner, all of those things matter when it comes to whether these folks feel like they value and trust higher education. I do think that's how you have to approach it. You can't go thinking you're going to change it nationally necessarily. It's all about the local.
Yeah, I do love that. And it ties back to what you were saying about being, if you can maintain your mission driven intent in your institution, that ties back to how you can drive, impact in your local community as well, and those connections as well. I do also, I love what you said too about, the feeling that their bachelor's or undergraduate degree was worth it. That so many folks, I think you said 79% felt that, that was a value and impact. And what I love about that stat too is we know that the further people are out, they actually do see value. Like they understand, oh, it's like, that's why I did that. Harder to see right away. And so, I do think there's an opportunity too, I wonder about creating, from the community, that connection back, once people have been out in employment for a little while, creating a little connection back, understanding what it is that they learned from that degree. I think it all comes back to, you're right, that local community impact too, that they can have such an important value. And that shifts seismically nationally over time.
Yeah, for sure. And certainly as a reporter who covers higher education now, I've reflected a lot about my bachelor's that I earned and what worked there, what may not have worked. But to your point, there are nuances there like, oh, that class really was teaching me critical thinking. I didn't think of it as critical thinking. Mm-hmm. When that professor, said, gave me that paper and said, I stopped reading at this point because it just didn't make sense. And I had to go back and revise it. Oh, what were they doing? Oh, they're giving me that feedback, but also I had to go and challenge myself, like, how do I sharpen this? It was a little bit humiliating at the time, but the point is I look back now as someone who has benefited from that. And again, it takes that sort of reflection. So to your point, having alumni kind of understand that over time is an interesting one. I would love to do more surveying of folks as they get farther away. I know some of this has been done before, but I think we could bring some nuance to it as well. But I think you make a good point there about how people may see their degree over a lifetime may change. And to your point, the ability of colleges to bring those alumni back, whether it's as mentors or to give them new lessons, right? We all know, and you've talked about the ability to have folks continue to learn throughout their professional careers and personal in some ways is really key to, I think, the vitality of colleges and also the vitality of Americans and perhaps the vitality of the country in general.
Well, if I could be a +1 for the Chronicle doing that research, I I would love to see that and understand it a little bit more, especially as people are shifting and changing jobs and things like that. I think it could be so interesting. So I'll get back to sort of the purpose of why we're here. I know there are many colleges who are trying really unique approaches. They're trying to think differently. They're trying to challenge themselves. Like we talked about, there's lots happening, and they're trying to say, what can we do differently? You've covered maybe many of these stories of colleges really trying to do something different. What are some examples of those that stand out, either as success stories or maybe, cautionary tales?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking for what are the examples, and I thought about it, and I was thinking about here are some of the experiments that I'm keeping an eye on right now. It's a little early to say whether they're completely success stories or cautionary tales, and time will tell, right? But first, that jumped to mind certainly when we talk about some of those trends. We're talking about technology. You and I have had conversation about the impact of AI. So, where are the interesting experiments going on with that? And the one that jumped to mind to me was Cal State, which is making ChatGPT available across all campuses and is really trying to seek to bolster the AI workforce and working with a couple big tech giants. And they've made something like a $17 million investment in this. This is a really interesting one to me. There are several institutions that have really doubled down on AI. University of Florida comes to mind, University of Southern California. But to me, those both are kind of one's a well-endowed private, one's certainly a flagship. And so to me, the Cal State one is interesting because of its focus. Back to sort of your you keep on coming back to this idea of your mission. I think this ties into my interest here because of them being the sort of the regional players and so focused on workforce and the audience that or the students that Cal State serve. And again, system-wide effort. So that's definitely an experiment I'm keeping an eye on. We'll see. Another one I was thinking about was the big push, which I think is going on somewhat quietly, though I don't think anyone in higher ed would be too surprised. But the push for experiential learning to try and teach some of those skills we've talked about, those durable skills. It could mean an internship, it could mean study abroad, it can mean a lot of different things. But there are institutions like the University of Georgia, which is now requiring it across all degrees. There's a couple other places that certainly have done it for a long time, but want to do even more of it. Making sure it's available to more students is a challenge. It does take money to do that, but that's an interesting area in general that I'm really curious about following up on at some point because I do think that has, as we know, the studies have shown that's a high impact practice. But how do you kind of scale it is tough. The other one, briefly, I was going to mention is the rise of apprenticeship degrees. They've been talked about for a long time, but I was thinking about this one institution we talked to a while back was Reach University. I think they're about 5 years old, nonprofit college in California, focused practically solely on apprenticeship degrees. And so I'm really fascinated by whether that model will really start to get hold. In part because it's been talked about for a while. And it's not that it's not a new thing, but I do think it's got a little bit more energy right now, a little bit more buzz. I do think perhaps even the Trump administration may get behind it in a way. We've seen them get behind a short-term Pell, for example, which is different, but obviously has a workforce focus. So that's an area that I think there could be some interesting experiments coming out of. And again, I think we'll see. It's a little early for me to say they're success or failures or cautionary tales, as you put it. But I think those are places that I want to keep a little bit of an eye on and see if we can say more about them in the future.
Yeah, I would love to have another conversation in a little
Sure
bit
thing.
and check in on some of these because I think it is fascinating, and I always do think too that this area, whether it's we're talking about internships, whether we're talking about AI, they move so fast. And so it's
Mm,
helpful to, have some conversations about what other people are trying, what other people are doing, rather than, just waiting and waiting and waiting for this stuff to come out in the broader literature later on. So yeah, looking forward to more of those conversations. And it sounds like that a lot of folks are taking some risks and trying to experiment and trying to sort of put themselves out there. And so it'll be really interesting to see where that goes.
I appreciate it.
We talked a lot about these stories now, and I would sort of say that I think the role of journalism is often underappreciated in the sector of higher education because, we kind of think about academic journals, we think about those sorts of things, which are, published by academics and stuff. But I think it misses some of this. How do you feel that reporting has shaped public perception of higher education? And how can institutions better engage with the media to try and meet some of the goals that they're trying to do?
The shaping part is an interesting one because I've never really stepped back as much to think about broadly how it shapes the narrative around higher education. I get the chance here, thankfully, to kind of poke at some of our what we like to think of as our competitors, like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. I do think sometimes there's an overly focus on, say, a certain selective tier of institutions. I think that's standard in part because I hate to say it, but the Times and the Wall Street Journal are read by people who may most likely wanting their kids to get into those institutions. I don't say that's the only reason they report on those places, but I do feel like sometimes the national narrative gets swallowed up by what's happening at Harvard. I hate to say it, we need to cover Harvard, we need to cover Princeton, we need to cover other places, but sometimes it gets so focused on those name brands that I feel like we ignore a lot of other things, specifically, say, community colleges. or those regional public colleges that are doing a lot of the workforce development in other areas and research as well. But they just are the workhorses of this higher education sector, and in teaching and graduating a very diverse student body and doing the majority of it. So again, I think that's where I feel like we actually in the media may fall down a bit when it comes to the discussions about higher education. I like to think that the media can do a better job, including the Chronicle, bringing nuances to these conversations about the critiques about higher ed, about questions about viewpoint diversity, about free speech, about anti-Semitism. I think we need to be able to kind of dive into those issues and hopefully have thoughtful debates, because there's so much sort of noise out there about that I hope we are doing a good enough job to cut through all of that. That's the big one that I think is important to us at the Chronicle, for sure, is again, one, trying to making sure we're really representing all of higher ed and the issues that they are facing, and then trying to bring a more nuance to these tricky conversations about how higher ed can perhaps reform itself. I want to be careful about that phrase and what that may mean, but I think that's something that folks are talking about. When it comes to better engaging with the media, at least for us at the Chronicle, because of who we are and the place that we get back to, I want to come back to like what we were just talking about, those places that are taking some risks. I love it when we get announcements. I love it when we hear from institutions saying, "Hey, we just finished this." But I'd love to. I've challenged folks about this before. Tell us when you're in the messy kind of middle part of that transformation. Tell us when there's the stakes are maybe pretty high, or there are stakes there, and we get to talk about it before you kind of know exactly what's happened. Because I think that process of transformation is for us to go in and look at it, talk about how you kind of get past some hurdles, what the hurdles that still may exist. It can be uncomfortable for an institution, but I think it's important for institutions to talk about how they are taking risks and they don't know always what the payoff is going to be. I think that's an important narrative to get out there a little bit, because I think more folks who talk about it, then more folks will talk about it. And there's a way for folks to kind of learn more, back to your point about, hey, how does higher education kind of learn from itself to better serve students specifically on certain ways? I think that would be really, really interesting for us to hear more about. Again, that sort of messy middle part of innovation, I think, is fascinating.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that the messy part of it, it's natural for all of us wanting to present the best side of things and the clean side, and look how great this thing is that we did. But I do think that there's a unique opportunity for schools, if I can put a plug into reaching out to the Chronicle for that exact reason, is it's a reflective point for them.
Mm-hmm.
They get to really start to think. So many times when we're doing a big transformation, I know it's true at our school, when we're doing something, you're in the middle of it and you're just pushing through to try and get to the next mile marker or the next step. And having that chance to actually think and reflect and have a conversation is actually worth its weight in gold in so many ways. So I hope you get many more of those conversations at schools. Okay, one final question, Ian, and then I will let you get back to your busy day. For leaders or faculty who feel stuck right now between the tradition or the way that they've always done things and this transformation that's happening, what advice would you give them to help them navigate this moment with both clarity and ideally purpose?
Now, I am reluctant to offer advice to those in the positions where they have to sit through the challenges that we've been talking about. So I'm going to borrow from someone I spoke to just recently. That's Beverly Daniel Tatum. She's the president emerita of Spelman College. She has a new book out. I was talking to her about Peril and Promise, which is about her experience as a college leader. Her last chapter was called Reasons for Joy. And I asked her about that, and it's apparently a quote from St. Benedict, which I'm not going to say because I'm going to get it wrong. But she was just recommending having those moments of reminding yourself when you have, say, an interaction with a student, or with that peaceful walk through campus she mentioned. The idea being, of course, this is, for self-care, we all can kind of embrace regardless of where we are, but just the idea of don't forget those moments. Don't forget those interactions. When you go to graduation and someone's coming across the stage to get their diploma and they may be the first in their family to get it, remember that moment and hold that moment for the following weeks when things are tough. I think folks can find many of those moments in their day, perhaps when they're on a campus working with students or even not. And I think that was great advice from Dr. Tatum that I think is worth getting out there to a higher education community that can feel, as you mentioned earlier, burnt out, perhaps even under attack a little bit politically, maybe not even a little bit, maybe a lot. So all of those things I think were healthy advice from Dr. Tatum, who I should also mention has studied psychology, so she knows the mind very well. So it was good advice, I thought.
I absolutely love that. And I think that is so true. a good reminder, not just for those in higher education, but in our personal lives too.
Right.
Finding those moments of joy and those moments to be grateful. I think that's so perfect way to end this. Ian, thank you so much for joining me, but also for opening up and sharing so much too. I think this is not only just gave us a different lens on higher education, but it certainly made me feel both optimistic and hopeful for the future of higher education as well. To all of you who are listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe. We'll have more exciting guests and conversations coming your way on this season of Success Reimagined. Until next time.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Holistic Success Show, please be sure to check out our other episodes. We have episodes coming out regularly all the time, so please be sure to subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all things related to student and program success in higher education.